Jake had been living on his little slice of heaven for almost 8 years, 5 acres of pure peace and quiet, with an old red barn sitting about 200 feet back from the road. The barn wasn't fancy, but it was his. He'd spent countless weekends fixing it up, turning it into a combination workshop and storage space. It had everything he needed: his tools, his old truck parts, boxes of memories from over the years, and plenty of room to tinker on projects whenever he felt like it. Life out there was exactly what he'd dreamed of when he bought the place. No neighbors breathing down his neck, no noise except the birds and the occasional tractor rumbling by on the main road. He could work on his projects in peace, have a bonfire without worrying about smoke complaints, and just exist without someone telling him what to do with his own property. Then everything changed about 6 months ago. The county decided to extend some boundaries, and suddenly his little piece of paradise was part of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. Jake didn't even know it was happening until he got a letter in the mail, welcoming him to the community and explaining all the rules he was now expected to follow. Rules about grass height, fence colors, what kind of decorations you could put up, what time you could take your trash cans to the curb. The list went on for pages. At first, Jake figured it wouldn't be a big deal. His property was neat enough. He kept the grass mowed, didn't have junk scattered around, and generally kept things looking decent. Sure, the barn was old and weathered, but it had character. It wasn't hurting anyone. Then he met Patricia Reynolds. Patricia lived 3 properties down from him in one of those newer houses that looked like it came straight out of a magazine. Everything about her place was perfect. The lawn looked like a golf course. The flowers were arranged in neat rows, and her mailbox probably got polished weekly. She'd recently been elected as the HOA president. And apparently, she took the job very seriously. Too seriously. The first time Jake saw her, she was walking down the road with a clipboard, stopping at each property and making notes. He was outside working on his truck when she came up his driveway, not even bothering to introduce herself properly. She just launched right into it. "I'm Patricia Reynolds, HOA president," she announced, looking at her clipboard instead of at him. "I'm doing an initial assessment of all properties in our jurisdiction. I see several issues already." Jake wiped his hands on a rag and tried to be polite. "Nice to meet you. What kind of issues?" She gestured toward his barn with her pen like she was pointing at a crime scene. "That structure is not in compliance with our aesthetic standards. The paint is peeling. The roof appears damaged in several places, and frankly, it's an eyesore that brings down the value of surrounding properties." Jake felt his jaw tighten. An eyesore? He'd put hundreds of hours into that barn. "It's a barn. It's supposed to look like a barn. And it's way back from the road. Nobody can even see it unless they come down my driveway." Patricia gave him a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The HOA has standards for all visible structures. You'll be receiving a formal notice within the week. I suggest you start getting estimates for renovation or removal." Removal? She wanted him to tear down his barn? Jake took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. "Look, I just got looped into this HOA thing. I didn't ask for it, and that barn was here long before any of these rules. I'm not tearing it down, and I'm not painting it to match somebody's idea of what a barn should look like." She made a note on her clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Failure to comply with HOA regulations results in fines. Continued failure can result in liens against your property. I'm just doing my job, keeping this neighborhood beautiful for everyone." Then she turned and walked back down his driveway without another word. True to her promise, Jake got an official violation notice in the mail 4 days later. The barn was listed as aesthetically inconsistent with neighborhood standards, and he had 30 days to remediate the issue or face a fine of $200. After that, the fines would increase monthly. Jake tossed the letter on his kitchen table and tried to ignore it. He had rights as a property owner, and some busybody with a clipboard couldn't just force him to destroy his own building. Besides, he'd checked with a buddy who knew real estate law, and apparently structures that existed before HOA rules took effect were supposed to be grandfathered in. He figured Patricia was just flexing her new authority and would eventually move on to bother someone else. He was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Patricia became a regular unwelcome visitor. She'd drive by slowly, stopping to take pictures of his property with her phone. Sometimes she'd park on the road and just sit there, staring at his barn like it had personally offended her. Twice, Jake came home from work to find notes tucked under his windshield wiper. printed reminders about his violation and upcoming fines. The worst part was that she started showing up when he was home, always with that clipboard, always with some new complaint. The grass near the barn was too long. There were unauthorized vehicles visible from the road, even though his old project truck was barely visible behind the barn. She claimed his driveway needed repaving because it had cracks. Jake tried to be patient. He really did. He'd calmly explain each time that he wasn't interested in complying with rules that didn't make sense for his property. He'd mention the grandfather clause. He'd point out that his barn wasn't bothering anyone. But Patricia always had the same response. Rules were rules, and the HOA had authority. Other neighbors started warning him about her, too. Bill from down the road stopped by one evening with a 6-pack of beer and some advice. She got me for having the wrong color trim on my shed. Cost me $400 in fines before I just repainted the thing. She's relentless, man. Doesn't know when to back off. An older couple who lived nearby told him similar stories. Patricia had cited them for having their garbage cans visible from the street, even though pickup was the next morning. She'd complained about their dog barking, their Christmas lights staying up too long, their vegetable garden being unsightly. The woman was building a reputation as the neighborhood tyrant, and Jake was quickly becoming her primary target. The violation notices kept coming. So did the visits. Patricia would show up at random times, always acting like she had some official reason to be there. She'd walk around taking pictures, measuring things with a tape measure she carried, making notes that she'd wave around like legal documents. Jake started to feel like he was being harassed. This wasn't normal HOA stuff. This was personal. Patricia had decided his barn was her mission, and she wasn't going to stop until she got her way. What he didn't know was just how far she was willing to go. It was a Saturday morning in late spring when things went from annoying to absolutely infuriating. Jake had left early to grab some supplies from the hardware store. He needed wood stain for a bookshelf he was building, and figured he'd make a quick run before it got too hot outside. The whole trip took maybe 45 minutes tops. When he pulled back into his driveway, he immediately noticed Patricia's silver SUV parked right there, taking up half the space. His first thought was that she'd come by to leave another one of her ridiculous notices. But as he parked and got out of his truck, he realized something was very wrong. The side door to his barn was standing wide open. Jake's heart started pounding. He always kept that door locked, always. He broke into a jog, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe someone had broken in, maybe kids were messing around in there. But that SUV definitely belonged to Patricia, and she was nowhere in sight near her vehicle. As he got closer to the barn, he could hear someone moving around inside. Not trying to be quiet either, just casually shuffling around like they had every right to be there. Jake stepped through the doorway and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Patricia was in his barn, not just standing there, but actively going through his stuff. She had his toolbox open and was taking pictures of the contents with her phone. Several of his storage boxes had been moved, some of them opened, their contents partially pulled out. She was wearing white gloves like she was handling evidence at a crime scene. For a moment, Jake just stood there, too shocked to speak. Then the anger hit him like a wave. "What the hell are you doing in my barn?" Patricia jumped slightly, clearly startled that he'd caught her. But she recovered quickly, straightening up and giving him that same condescending look she always had. "I'm conducting an official HOA inspection. As president, I have the authority to document code violations on any property within our jurisdiction." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You broke into my property. This is trespassing. You need to leave. Right now." She held up her phone, showing him the photos she'd been taking. "I have documented numerous safety violations. Improperly stored chemicals, electrical hazards, structural concerns. This building is a danger to the neighborhood. Those are wood stains and paint, regular stuff that anyone who does projects would have. And you have no right to be in here." Jake pulled out his own phone. "Get out now or I'm calling the sheriff." Patricia's expression hardened. She wasn't used to people standing up to her. "You're making a big mistake. The HOA board will hear about your hostile attitude. We're trying to help you understand that this structure is a liability. It's my property." Jake's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "You can't just walk into someone's private building and go through their things. That's illegal, Patricia. You know that's illegal." She carefully pulled off her white gloves and tucked them into her purse, taking her sweet time like she was trying to prove she wasn't intimidated. "I'll be filing a comprehensive report with the board. You can expect significant fines for the violations I've documented today. And if you continue to obstruct HOA business, we can pursue legal action." Jake stepped aside from the doorway and pointed toward the exit. "Out. Now." Patricia walked past him with her head held high like she'd won some kind of victory. As she reached the door, she turned back. "You really should consider cooperating. Things will be much easier for you if you just follow the rules like everyone else." Then she was gone, her SUV kicking up gravel as she backed out of his driveway way too fast. Jake stood in his barn, looking around at the mess she'd left behind. Boxes moved, tools disturbed, his privacy completely violated. He was shaking with anger. This wasn't just about some stupid barn renovation anymore. This woman had actually broken into his property. That was a crime. That was way over the line. He called the non-emergency number for the sheriff's department and filed a report. The deputy who came out was sympathetic but not particularly helpful. He took notes, looked around, and basically told Jake that without proof of forced entry or theft, it would be hard to press charges. Patricia would just claim she had permission or that the door was open. It would be his word against hers. Still, the deputy said it was good to have it documented, especially if she tried something like this again. He suggested Jake get better locks and maybe a security camera. After the deputy left, Jake spent the rest of the day checking his barn thoroughly. Nothing seemed to be missing, which was something at least. But the feeling of violation remained. Someone had been in his space, touching his things, invading his privacy. As he was reorganizing one of the storage areas near the back wall, he noticed something he'd completely forgotten about. Up in the rafters, tucked into the corner where two beams met, was a wasp nest. And it wasn't small. The thing was huge, probably the size of a basketball, with wasps crawling all over it. Jake had noticed it forming earlier in the spring but had been too busy to deal with it. The wasps seemed to keep to themselves up there, and since he didn't spend much time in that corner of the barn, he'd kept putting off calling an exterminator. Now looking at it, he realized it had grown significantly. He made a mental note to take care of it soon. The last thing he needed was to get stung while working on projects. But for now, he was too angry about Patricia to think about wasps. That evening, Jake did something he rarely did. He called an attorney. Not a fancy lawyer, just a guy named Rick who'd helped him with some paperwork when he bought the property. Rick listened to the whole story and gave him some advice that was both good and frustrating. Yes, Patricia had committed trespassing. But proving it would be hard, and taking legal action would cost money and time. The better approach would be to document everything, get cameras installed, and make it crystal clear in writing to the HOA board that they had no authority to enter his property without permission. Rick offered to draft a formal cease and desist letter for a reasonable fee. Jake agreed. At least having something official in writing might make Patricia think twice before pulling another stunt like this. Over the next week, Jake installed 3 security cameras around his property. One covered the driveway, one covered the front of the barn, and one covered the side door. He also upgraded all the locks and made sure everything was secure. If Patricia or anyone else tried to get into his barn again, he'd have video proof. He also received Rick's cease and desist letter and sent it certified mail to both Patricia personally and to the HOA board. It was formal and clear. No one from the HOA had permission to enter his property without advance written notice and his explicit approval. Any future trespassing would result in criminal charges and civil action. For about a week, things were quiet. No visits from Patricia, no new violation notices, nothing. Jake started to think maybe the letter had actually worked. Maybe she'd finally gotten the message and would leave him alone. But he should have known better. People like Patricia didn't back down just because they were told they were wrong. They doubled down. They found new ways to push boundaries. They convinced themselves they were justified in whatever they did, because they were the ones enforcing the rules. Jake didn't know it yet, but Patricia wasn't done with him. Not even close. She was just getting started. And her next move would be so outrageous, so completely unbelievable, that Jake would barely be able to process it when it happened. The wasps in the corner of the barn continued building their nest, unbothered and undisturbed, growing larger by the day. Jake walked past them countless times, always meaning to call someone about removal. always putting it off because there were more pressing things to deal with. Sometimes, the universe has a way of connecting dots that seem completely unrelated. An annoying neighbor, a forgotten wasp nest, a barn that someone wanted to control. Soon all these pieces would come together in the most unexpected way. 2 weeks after Jake sent the cease and desist letter, his nephew got married. The wedding was 3 states away, and Jake had promised months ago that he'd be there. His sister would never forgive him if he missed it. So on a Friday afternoon in early June, Jake packed a bag, double-checked all his locks, made sure his security cameras were recording, and headed out for what was supposed to be a nice, relaxing weekend with family. The wedding was on Saturday evening, and he planned to drive back Sunday afternoon, 2 nights away from home tops. He figured his property would be fine for that short amount of time. After all, he had cameras now. He had good locks. And surely even Patricia wouldn't be crazy enough to try anything after receiving a legal letter from an attorney. The wedding was beautiful. His nephew looked happy, the food was great, and Jake actually managed to relax and enjoy himself for the first time in weeks. He stayed Sunday morning for a family breakfast, said his goodbyes around noon, and started the long drive home. He pulled into his driveway around 7 in the evening, just as the sun was starting to set. The first thing he noticed was tire tracks, multiple sets of them, cutting right across his front lawn, through the flower bed his mother had helped him plant 3 years ago. The flowers were completely crushed, dirt scattered everywhere. Jake's stomach dropped. Something was very wrong. As he drove further up toward the house, he saw more evidence. Red Solo cups scattered on the grass. What looked like streamers or decorations caught in the bushes. And then he heard it. Music. Actual music coming from somewhere on his property. His barn. The main barn doors were wide open, and light was pouring out into the growing darkness. Jake could hear voices, laughter, the unmistakable sounds of people having a party. On his property. In his barn. He sat in his truck for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. Nobody could be this bold, this completely out of their mind. But the evidence was right in front of him. Someone was having a party in his barn. Jake got out and walked toward the open doors, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and rage. As he got closer, he could see inside more clearly. There were at least 15 people in there, maybe more. Someone had set up string lights across the rafters. His workbench had been turned into a makeshift bar. Bottles and mixers lined up on top of his tools. Folding chairs that definitely weren't his were arranged in groups. People were standing around drinking, talking, laughing like this was completely normal. And right in the middle of it all, holding court like she owned the place, was Patricia. She was wearing a sundress and holding a red Solo cup, gesturing animatedly as she talked to a group of people who Jake recognized as other HOA board members and their spouses. She looked like she was having the time of her life. Jake stepped through the barn doors and the music was even louder inside. Nobody noticed him at first. He just stood there, trying to comprehend the sheer audacity of what was happening. Then someone near the door spotted him, and the conversation started to die down. One by one, people turned to look at him, and the music seemed way too loud in the growing silence. Patricia turned around, saw him, and smiled. Actually smiled like him showing up was part of the plan. "Oh, perfect, you're back," she called out cheerfully. "We were hoping you'd make it." Jake found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "What is happening right now?"
"Why are there people in my barn?"
Patricia set down her cup and walked toward him, still smiling like this was all perfectly reasonable. "The board met last week and voted on a new initiative. Since you've been unwilling to properly maintain this structure, we've decided the best solution is to repurpose it for community use. This is our inaugural barn warming party. We're showing everyone the potential this space has." Jake stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to admit this was some kind of joke. But she just stood there completely serious, like she just explained something perfectly logical. "You broke into my property," Jake said slowly, trying to stay calm. "You're trespassing. All of you." A man Jake recognized as the HOA vice president stepped forward. "We have documentation that shows this structure is in violation of multiple codes. The board voted to assume temporary management until proper improvements are made." "You don't have that authority," Jake said, pulling out his phone. "This is my property. You're all trespassing, and I'm calling the sheriff right now." Patricia's smile finally faded. "Now let's not be hasty. We can discuss this like adults. The community has a right to stay off my property. Jake's voice rose. You got a lawyer letter 2 weeks ago. You were explicitly told not to come on my property, and now you've broken in and thrown a party? Some of the people in the crowd started looking uncomfortable. A few began quietly moving toward the door, clearly realizing they'd been involved in something they shouldn't have been. But the core group of HOA board members stood their ground. Patricia pulled some papers from her purse and waved them at him. We have approval from the HOA board. 3 members voted in favor of the community use proposal. It's all legal. The HOA doesn't own my barn. Jake started dialing 911. You have 10 seconds to get everyone out of here or I'm having you all arrested for trespassing. 10, 9, 8. That got people moving. The crowd started hurrying toward the door, grabbing their drinks and belongings. Apologies were muttered, people avoiding eye contact with Jake as they rushed past him. Some of them clearly hadn't known this was Jake's private property. They'd been told it was some kind of community event space. Within a minute, most of the party guests had scattered to their cars and were driving away. But Patricia remained, along with 3 other board members. A woman named Jennifer who served as secretary, the vice president named Doug, and a guy named Tom who was the treasurer. This is ridiculous, Patricia said, crossing her arms. We're trying to improve the neighborhood and you're being incredibly selfish. That lawyer letter doesn't change the fact that this structure is in violation. Jake finished dialing and held the phone to his ear. Sheriff's Department? Yes, I need to report a trespassing situation. Multiple people broke into my barn and… Fine, Patricia snapped. We're leaving, but you're going to regret this. The fines are going to keep piling up, and eventually the HOA will have the right to place a lien on your property. We'll get this barn one way or another. The 4 of them started walking toward the door, Patricia leading the way with her head held high like she'd done nothing wrong. Doug and Tom looked angry but were keeping quiet. Jennifer looked uncertain, like maybe she was starting to realize they'd crossed a serious line. Jake stayed on the line with the dispatcher, giving his address and explaining the situation. The board members were almost to the door now, almost off his property, and Jake felt something snap inside him. These people had invaded his space, vandalized his lawn, broken into his barn, and thrown a party like they owned the place. They'd showed such complete disrespect for his property rights that he couldn't just let them walk away feeling victorious. His eyes drifted up to the rafters, to that corner where the wasp nest had been growing all spring, the nest he'd been meaning to deal with but had kept putting off. It was massive now, probably home to hundreds of wasps, and it hung there in the shadows, completely undisturbed by the party that had been happening below it. An idea formed in his mind. It was probably not the smartest thing he'd ever thought of. It was definitely petty. But in that moment, with rage still coursing through him and these people acting like they were the victims, Jake decided he didn't care about being the bigger person. The dispatcher was still on the line, saying something about sending a deputy out to take a report. Jake told her that the trespassers were leaving, but he'd still like someone to come out to document everything. She said someone would be there within 30 minutes. Patricia and her group had stopped just outside the barn doors. They were standing there on his property, arguing among themselves about what to do next, still acting like they had some kind of right to be there. Jake made his decision. He grabbed a long pole he used for reaching high shelves and maintenance work. It was about 12 feet long, sturdy enough for what he had in mind. "Hey, Patricia," he called out. "Before you go, I think there's something you should see." She turned around, suspicious but curious. "What?" Jake walked toward the back corner of the barn, the pole in his hands. "You did such a thorough inspection before. I'm surprised you missed this safety hazard up here." He raised the pole toward the rafters, toward the massive wasp nest hanging in the shadows. Patricia and her little group stepped back toward the barn entrance, drawn by curiosity about what Jake was pointing at. They couldn't see the nest clearly from where they were standing. The lights from the party had been focused on the center of the barn, leaving the corners in shadow. But Jake could see it perfectly from his angle. The massive paper structure hanging from the beam, wasps crawling all over its surface, completely undisturbed by all the noise and activity that had been happening below. "What are you talking about?" Patricia demanded, taking a few steps inside to get a better look. Jake positioned himself carefully. He knew exactly where the small side door was, the same door Patricia had broken through to get in the first time. The door that he'd reinforced with a better lock but had left accessible from the inside. His escape route was planned. Right up there, he said, pointing with the pole. You were so concerned about safety violations. Thought you should see the biggest one. Then, before anyone could react or understand what he was doing, Jake lifted the pole and gave the wasp nest a solid tap. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The nest shuddered from the impact, and within seconds wasps started pouring out. Not just a few, hundreds of them, angry and disoriented, swarming out of their disturbed home. The buzzing sound went from barely noticeable to overwhelming in a heartbeat. Jake didn't wait around to watch. He dropped the pole and sprinted for the side door, reaching it in seconds. He yanked it open, slipped through, and slammed it shut behind him. His fingers worked the lock quickly, securing it from the outside. His heart was pounding, adrenaline surging, but he'd made it out without a single sting. Inside the barn, chaos erupted. Through the walls, Jake could hear the screaming start. Patricia's voice was the loudest, shrieking in a pitch he didn't think human voices could reach. The others were yelling too, panicked and confused about what was happening. The wasps, now fully mobilized and very angry about having their home attacked, were doing what wasps do best. They were defending their territory. Jake moved quickly around to the front of the barn. He could see the 4 board members stumbling toward the main doors, arms flailing, swatting frantically at the air around them. They burst out of the barn like they'd been shot from a cannon, still screaming, wasps following them into the evening air. Patricia ran straight for her SUV, moving faster than Jake had ever seen anyone in heels move. Doug wasn't far behind her, slapping at his neck and arms. Tom was doing some kind of frantic dance, spinning in circles and cursing loudly. Jennifer had lost one of her shoes and was running lopsided across the lawn, her hair coming loose from whatever style she'd had it in. The wasps were relentless. They'd been disturbed from their nest and they weren't interested in forgiving or forgetting. They followed the fleeing HOA members across the property, darting and diving, delivering stings with precision. Jake stood near his truck, safely away from the chaos, and watched. He probably should have felt bad. A better person would have felt guilty about what he'd just done. But after everything Patricia and her board had put him through, after the harassment, the trespassing, the complete disrespect for his rights, he felt nothing but satisfaction. Patricia reached her SUV and fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice before finally getting the door open. Even from a distance, Jake could see the red welts already forming on her arms. She practically threw herself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind her. Doug had made it to his own car and was inside, visible through the window as he continued swatting at wasps that had followed him in. Tom was still in the open, having apparently been stung enough times that he'd given up running and was just standing there taking it. His arms wrapped over his head. Jennifer had made it to the road and was just running, one shoe on and one shoe off, probably hoping the wasps would lose interest if she got far enough away. The whole scene was absurd. It would have been funny if it wasn't also kind of terrible. But Jake had to remind himself that these people had brought this on themselves. They'd broken into his property, thrown an unauthorized party, and showed absolutely no respect for his rights as a property owner. The wasps were just nature's way of serving eviction notices. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the board members had all managed to get to their vehicles or flee the property. Patricia's SUV roared to life and she backed out of the driveway way too fast, nearly clipping his mailbox. Doug's sedan followed close behind. Tom finally made it to his truck, and the vehicle lurched down the driveway with him, still swatting at something inside the cab. Jake didn't see where Jennifer ended up, but he heard a car start up from the road a minute later and figured she'd made it to safety. The wasps, having successfully defended their territory, began to settle down. Some returned to the barn, probably to assess the damage to their nest. Others dispersed into the evening air, looking for new threats to address. Within 10 minutes, most of them had disappeared, either back to the nest or off to wherever wasps go when they're done stinging people. Jake waited another 5 minutes to be safe, then carefully approached the barn. He could still see a few wasps flying around near the rafters, but they seemed to have lost interest in attacking anything. They were just going about their business, probably confused about what had just happened. The barn was a mess. The party decorations were still up, the string lights casting everything in a weird festive glow that seemed completely wrong given what had just occurred. The makeshift bar was still set up, bottles and cups abandoned when everyone fled. Chairs were knocked over. Someone had dropped their phone. The screen cracked. Jake made a mental note not to go fully inside until he could call a professional to remove the nest properly. But from the doorway, he could see that the wasps had settled down considerably. They'd done their job. The invaders had been repelled. About 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled up. It was the same guy who'd come out when Jake reported Patricia's first break-in. He got out of his car, looking around at the tire tracks, the crushed flowers, the scattered red cups. "Rough evening?" the deputy asked. Jake gave him the rundown. The party, the trespassing, the confrontation. He showed the deputy the security camera footage on his phone. It was all there. Multiple vehicles arriving, people entering his barn without permission, the whole unauthorized event. "You'll want to save all that footage," the deputy said, making notes. "This is clear-cut trespassing." "Multiple witnesses, too, from what you're describing. And you've got that cease and desist letter on file from last time?" Jake nodded. "Sent it certified mail. Have the receipts showing they received it." The deputy shook his head, looking genuinely amazed. "I've seen HOA disputes get out of hand before, but this is something else. Breaking in and throwing a party? That's bold even for the worst HOA presidents I've dealt with." "Can I press charges?" Jake asked. "You absolutely can. I'll file this report tonight, and you can follow up with the prosecutor's office on Monday. With video evidence and the prior cease and desist, you've got a solid case. They'll probably try to claim they had authorization or that it was a misunderstanding, but that footage doesn't lie." The deputy walked around the property, documenting the damage, the crushed flowers, the tire tracks, the mess in the barn. He took photos of everything, including the scattered party supplies. "What's that buzzing sound?" the deputy asked at one point, looking up at the barn. "Wasps," Jake said simply. "Big nest up in the rafters. I've been meaning to get it removed." The deputy took a step back from the barn entrance. "Might want to make that a priority. Those things can be dangerous." Jake almost laughed. "Yeah, I found that out tonight." After the deputy left, Jake stood in his driveway looking at his property in the fading light. The damage would take some time to fix. The flowers could be replanted. The lawn would recover. The barn would need a thorough cleaning once the wasps were professionally removed. But the satisfaction he felt was worth all of it. Patricia and her board had finally gone too far, and they'd done it in a way that was completely documentable and legally actionable. The video footage alone was damning. Breaking into someone's property to throw a party wasn't a gray area. It wasn't something they could spin or explain away. And the wasps, those angry, territorial wasps, had delivered a form of justice that no legal system could match. Every sting Patricia and her friends received would be a reminder of what happens when you push someone too far. When you disrespect boundaries. When you think rules apply to everyone except you. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his sister, asking how the drive home had been. He typed back that it had been fine, and that he'd had some excitement when he got home, but everything was handled now. She sent back a smiley face and told him she was glad he'd made it to the wedding. He looked back at his barn, at the string lights still glowing inside, at the evidence of the party scattered across his property. Tomorrow he'd start cleaning up. Tomorrow he'd call a professional to handle the wasp nest. Tomorrow he'd follow up on pressing charges and making sure Patricia and her board faced real consequences. But tonight, he was just going to savor the image of Patricia running across his lawn, screaming about wasps, her perfect HOA president composure completely shattered. Monday morning came with a mission. Jake woke up early, made a strong pot of coffee, and started making phone calls. First up was a pest control company that specialized in wasp removal. The technician who answered sounded impressed when Jake described the size of the nest. "That's a big one," the tech said. "We can get someone out there this afternoon if you're available. We'll remove it safely and make sure they don't come back." Jake scheduled the appointment, relieved to finally have that problem handled properly. Then he called his attorney, Rick, and filled him in on everything that had happened over the weekend. Rick listened quietly, asking a few clarifying questions, and then gave a low whistle. "They threw a party. In your barn." After receiving a cease and desist letter, Rick sounded like he was trying not to laugh. "Jake, this is the kind of case lawyers dream about. It's so clear-cut that even a first-year law student could win it." Rick advised Jake to head down to the courthouse and file formal trespassing charges against Patricia and the other board members. With the video evidence and the deputy's report, the prosecutor would likely take the case seriously. Rick also mentioned they could pursue a civil suit for damages, harassment, and emotional distress if Jake wanted to go that route. I just want them to leave me alone, Jake said. I don't need their money. I just need them to understand that my property is my property. Filing charges will send that message loud and clear, Rick assured him. Once they're facing criminal trespassing charges, I guarantee they'll back off. After hanging up with Rick, Jake spent an hour downloading all the security footage from his cameras. He burned it to a DVD, made a backup copy, and saved it to the cloud for good measure. The footage was damning. It showed multiple vehicles arriving. Patricia using what looked like a key to open the barn door. She'd apparently had a copy made somehow. And then the whole party unfolding. Around noon, Jake drove to the courthouse and filed the paperwork to press charges. The clerk who helped him process everything raised her eyebrows when she saw the video and read the deputy's report. HOA president, huh? She said, shaking her head. I swear some people get a tiny bit of authority and lose their minds. Jake couldn't have said it better himself. The pest control technician arrived at 3 o'clock. A friendly guy named Carlos who'd been removing wasp nests for 15 years. He suited up in protective gear and went into the barn with professional confidence. Jake watched from a safe distance as Carlos carefully removed the nest, spraying it first to calm the wasps, then detaching it from the beam and placing it in a sealed container. You're lucky nobody got seriously hurt with a nest this size, Carlos said after the job was done. These aren't your regular paper wasps. These are yellow jackets. More aggressive, more likely to swarm. You had probably 400 or 500 of them in there. Jake thought about Patricia and her board members running screaming across his lawn and felt zero sympathy. I think a few people learned that lesson the hard way, Carlos laughed. Well, they're gone now. I've treated the area so they won't build another nest in the same spot. You're all clear. After Carlos left, Jake finally went into his barn to assess the full damage and clean up. The party decorations came down first. The string lights, the makeshift bar setup, the folding chairs that didn't belong to him. He piled it all by the front door to deal with later. Maybe he'd return it. Maybe he'd donate it. Maybe he'd just trash it. He hadn't decided. He found Patricia's clipboard tucked behind one of the chairs. It was full of notes about his property, measurements, sketches of the barn layout, and what looked like plans for how they were going to convert his barn into a community space. There were drawings of what they envisioned, a renovated interior with better lighting, finished walls, even a small kitchenette area. They'd been planning this for a while. This wasn't some impulsive decision made at a board meeting. Patricia had been scheming about taking over his barn, probably ever since he refused to tear it down or renovate it to her standards. Jake added the clipboard to his evidence collection. It showed premeditation, which would only strengthen his case. Over the next few days, the neighborhood grapevine worked overtime. Jake didn't have to say anything. People saw the sheriff's deputy's car, heard about the party, and word spread. He got visits from 3 different neighbors, all of them stopping by to express their support. About time someone stood up to her, Bill from down the road said, sitting on Jake's porch and drinking the beer Jake had offered him. Patricia's been making everyone miserable. My wife was talking about moving just to get away from the constant violation notices. Another neighbor, an older man named Frank, brought over some plants to help replace the crushed flower bed. My wife wanted me to tell you we're proud of you. The HOA was supposed to keep property values up and maintain standards, not harass people in their own homes. Even people Jake barely knew were stopping by or sending messages of support. It turned out Patricia had made enemies all over the neighborhood with her aggressive enforcement of petty rules. Jake's situation had just been the most extreme example. On Wednesday, Jake got a call from the prosecutor's office. A woman named Lisa explained that they were moving forward with criminal trespassing charges against Patricia Reynolds, Douglas Chen, Thomas Wright, and Jennifer Morrison, all 4 board members who had remained in the barn after Jake told them to leave. We're offering them a plea deal, Lisa explained. Community service, fines, and a restraining order that will prevent them from coming within 100 feet of your property. If they don't take it, we go to trial, and with your video evidence, I'm confident we'll win. Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. What about the HOA itself? Can they still fine me or try to force me to change the barn? That's a civil matter, Lisa said. But I'll tell you this, once these charges are public, which they will be today, the HOA board is going to have much bigger problems than your barn. I'd be surprised if Patricia Reynolds remains president by the end of the week. Lisa was right. By Friday afternoon, Jake received an email from the HOA. Patricia Reynolds had resigned as president effective immediately. Douglas Chen had also stepped down as vice president. The remaining board members were calling an emergency election for new leadership and, in the meantime, all pending violation notices were suspended pending review. Jake read the email twice to make sure he wasn't imagining it. They were backing off. Completely. A week later, he got another email from the new interim HOA president, a reasonable-sounding woman named Helen who lived on the other side of the neighborhood. She apologized for the previous board's overreach, explained that they were reviewing all policies to ensure they were fair and legally sound, and confirmed that Jake's barn was grandfathered in under pre-existing structure rules and would not face any future violation notices. Helen also mentioned that several neighbors had complained about Patricia's aggressive enforcement tactics, and the board was implementing new oversight measures to prevent future abuses of authority. It was everything Jake had wanted from the beginning. To be left alone to enjoy his property in peace. The criminal charges moved forward on schedule. Patricia and the other 3 board members took the plea deal rather than go to trial. They each received 100 hours of community service, paid fines totaling $5,000 split among them, and were issued restraining orders preventing them from coming near Jake's property. Patricia also had to send a formal written apology, though it was clearly written by her lawyer and contained no actual remorse, just legal language about regret and misunderstanding. Jake read it once and filed it away with all the other documentation. He didn't need her apology. He had his peace and quiet back. The barn stood exactly as it had before any of this started. Weathered red paint, slightly crooked doors, full of Jake's tools and projects and memories. It wasn't perfect by anyone's standards except his own, but it was his. And now everyone in the neighborhood knew it. Jake kept the patched-up area where the wasp nest had been. Carlos had sealed the spot, but you could still see where it had attached to the beam. Every time Jake looked at it, he smiled. That nest had been a problem he'd kept meaning to solve, and in the end, it had solved his biggest problem for him. Some of the neighbors started calling him the Wasp Whisperer as a joke. Jake didn't mind. Better that than being the guy who got pushed around by his HOA. He replaced the flowers in the front bed, filling it with hardy perennials that could survive anything. He fixed the tire tracks in the lawn, overseeding the damaged areas until you couldn't tell anything had happened. He cleaned his barn from top to bottom, organized everything properly, and even added some better lighting so he could work on projects in the evening. Life returned to normal. The quiet, peaceful normal he'd enjoyed before the HOA had extended their reach to his property. He worked on his projects, fixed up his old truck, and spent evenings on his porch watching the sun set over his 5 acres. Patricia moved away about 3 months later. Someone said she'd taken a job in another state, but Jake suspected the truth was that she couldn't handle living in a neighborhood where everyone knew what she'd done, where she'd gone from powerful HOA president to convicted trespasser who'd been chased off someone's property by wasps. The story B.